Hollywood sold us trust. These were actors cast as heroes, mentors, and protectors, faces audiences believed were safe. But behind the roles were actions later confirmed through court records, guilty pleas, or public admissions. This is not rumor. This is not speculation. Every name on this list was exposed by documented evidence and protected by silence for far too long. So the question isn't who was exposed, it's how long it took. Which case shocked you the most? 15. Bill Cosby. For decades, Bill Cosby was presented as one of the safest figures in American entertainment. He built a reputation as a family-friendly comedian and actor, most famously as the patriarch on The Cosby Show, a series that defined wholesome television for a generation. His public image was carefully maintained. A respected entertainer, a moral voice in interviews, and a symbol of stability in popular culture. That image made him unusually powerful and unusually protected. Behind the scenes, however, a very different record was slowly forming. Over many years, multiple women came forward describing encounters that followed strikingly similar patterns. For a long time, these accounts were dismissed, minimized, or handled quietly through legal settlements. The cases did not initially end Cosby's career. Instead, his status allowed him to continue performing, touring, and appearing in public as if nothing had changed. The turning point came when sworn testimony, depositions, and corroborating statements became impossible to ignore. In a civil deposition that later became public, Cosby admitted to obtaining sedatives with the intent to give them to women before sexual encounters. This admission fundamentally altered how the allegations were understood. What had once been framed as conflicting stories was now supported by Cosby's own words under oath. In criminal court, Cosby was eventually convicted on charges related to aggravated indecent assault. The verdict marked one of the most significant moments of accountability in modern entertainment history. Although the conviction was later overturned on procedural grounds, the underlying evidence, testimony, and admissions remain part of the public record and permanently changed how his legacy is viewed. The consequences were immediate and lasting. Television networks removed reruns of his work, honors were rescinded, and institutions distanced themselves from his name. What once symbolized trust and family values became a case study in how power, reputation, and silence can shield misconduct for decades. Cosby's story is not remembered for a single moment, but for how long confirmed behavior was allowed to remain hidden behind fame. 14. Danny Masterson. Danny Masterson rose to fame during the late 1990s and early 2000s as a recognizable television actor, best known for his role on That 70s Show. His on-screen persona was confident, sarcastic, and charismatic, a combination that made him popular with audiences and well-connected within the industry. For years, his career progressed without public controversy, and he remained a familiar face in television and streaming projects. Away from the camera, however, multiple women accused Masterson of serious misconduct dating back to the early years of his fame. These allegations were not isolated or sudden. They emerged independently over time, with consistent descriptions of behavior, locations, and circumstances. Initially, the claims did not result in immediate legal consequences. As with many high-profile figures, the process moved slowly, complicated by legal challenges and public skepticism. The case eventually reached criminal court, where testimony, forensic evidence, and witness accounts were examined in detail. Prosecutors presented a narrative supported by corroborating facts rather than speculation. After extensive proceedings, Danny Masterson was convicted on multiple counts related to serious criminal acts. The verdict was the result of a formal judicial process, not public opinion or media pressure. Following his conviction, Masterson received a lengthy prison sentence, marking a definitive end to his acting career. Studios, networks, and collaborators distanced themselves entirely, and his previous work became overshadowed by the outcome of the trial. Unlike cases that remain unresolved or disputed, this was a clear instance of legal accountability based on courtroom evidence. Masterson's downfall illustrates how long-standing allegations can persist beneath the surface of a successful career before finally being addressed. His case is often cited as an example of how fame, industry connections, and institutional silence can delay consequences but not prevent them. Once the evidence was fully examined under law, the image carefully built over years collapsed completely, leaving a record defined not by roles or performances, but by the judgment of the court. 13. Jeffrey Jones. For much of his career, Jeffrey Jones was known as a reliable character actor, often cast in authoritative or eccentric roles that left a lasting impression despite limited screen time. He appeared in widely recognized films such as Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Beetlejuice, becoming a familiar face to audiences without ever occupying the spotlight reserved for leading men. His reputation within Hollywood was that of a seasoned professional, dependable, experienced, and quietly respected. That image began to fracture in the early 2000s, when Jones was arrested and later convicted on charges related to unlawful conduct involving a minor. The case did not emerge from tabloid rumor or anonymous accusations, but from a formal investigation that resulted in legal consequences. Court records documented the offense, and Jones ultimately entered a plea that confirmed the underlying facts of the case. The outcome placed his name on a public registry, making the situation both verifiable and permanent. Unlike some high-profile scandals that unfold under intense media glare, Jones's case moved forward with relatively little spectacle. There were no dramatic press conferences or prolonged public defenses. Instead, the legal process spoke for itself. The conviction established a clear line between his on-screen legacy and his real-world actions, leaving little room for ambiguity about the seriousness of the offense. The consequences for his career were immediate and irreversible. Casting offers stopped, studios distanced themselves, and his presence in mainstream film and television effectively ended. While some of his past performances continue to exist in popular culture, his name is now inseparable from the documented outcome of his case. There was no comeback, rebranding, or redemption arc offered by the industry. Jeffrey Jones's story highlights a recurring pattern in Hollywood history. Individuals who maintained long careers on the margins of fame, protected by low visibility, until formal legal action brought everything into the open. His exposure did not come from public outrage or cultural shifts alone, but from a criminal conviction that permanently altered how his career is remembered. 12. Mark Salling. Mark Salling rose to prominence during the early 2010s as part of the ensemble cast of Glee, a series that blended pop culture, music, and youth-oriented storytelling into a global phenomenon. His character was marketed as awkward and harmless, contributing to an image that felt approachable rather than threatening. At the height of the show's popularity, Salling enjoyed fame, fan support, and a growing presence within television and music-related projects. Behind the scenes, however, Salling's personal life was moving toward a legal reckoning. In the mid-2010s, federal authorities initiated an investigation that led to his arrest on charges involving illegal material. The case did not rely on third-party accusations or disputed testimony. Instead, it was built on direct evidence obtained through a formal law enforcement process. Salling later entered a guilty plea in federal court, confirming the charges against him. The plea marked a decisive moment in his public downfall. Once the facts became part of the court record, his career effectively ended overnight. Networks removed his name from future projects, and his association with Glee became increasingly uncomfortable for both fans and former collaborators. The industry response was swift, reflecting the clarity and seriousness of the legal outcome. Before sentencing could be completed, Salling died by suicide. While this prevented the case from reaching its final procedural conclusion, the guilty plea remained part of the official record. From a legal standpoint, the admission of guilt stands as a confirmed fact, not an allegation or unresolved claim. His death did not erase the documented evidence or the plea he entered under oath. Mark Salling's case remains one of the most sobering examples of how quickly a carefully constructed public image can collapse once formal evidence emerges. It also underscores how fame does not prevent accountability, when the facts are clear. His legacy is no longer defined by chart-topping performances or television success, but by a case that serves as a reminder of how confirmed misconduct permanently reshapes public memory. 11. Stephen Collins. For many years, Stephen Collins was associated with calm authority and moral stability on screen. He built a long television career portraying thoughtful professionals, most notably as a minister and father figure on Seventh Heaven, a series explicitly marketed around family values, faith, and trust. His casting was not accidental. Collins's public persona aligned closely with the reassuring characters he played, making him a familiar and credible presence in American living rooms. That image collapsed when recordings and public statements revealed behavior Collins himself acknowledged. Unlike cases built on conflicting accounts, this situation became undeniable because Collins admitted to inappropriate conduct involving minors during therapy sessions that were later disclosed. His own words, captured and reported by major media outlets, removed ambiguity from the situation. There was no criminal trial resulting in imprisonment, but the admission itself was documented and widely confirmed. The fallout was swift and decisive. Networks immediately cut ties, and Seventh Heaven reruns were re-evaluated in light of the revelations. Honors and public appearances disappeared almost overnight. Collins did not attempt a prolonged public defense or deny the accounts once they became public. Instead, the record stood largely on what he had already admitted privately, which fundamentally altered how his career was understood. What made this case particularly disturbing to many viewers was the contrast between Collins's on-screen roles and his real-life admissions. He was not known for edgy or provocative characters, but for embodying guidance and restraint. That contradiction amplified public reaction once the facts were known. The sense of betrayal felt by audiences stemmed directly from the trust his roles had cultivated over decades. Stephen Collins's case demonstrates that legal conviction is not the only form of exposure that permanently reshapes a legacy. Documented admissions, especially when supported by recordings and corroborating accounts, carry their own irreversible weight. His career did not end because of speculation or rumor, but because confirmed information made continued public acceptance impossible. In Hollywood history, his name now serves as an example of how a carefully maintained image can be dismantled by facts the individual himself acknowledged. 10. Cuba Gooding Jr. Cuba Gooding Jr. achieved a level of success that many actors never reach. An Academy Award winner, he was celebrated for his performances in Jerry Maguire, Boys and the Hood, and numerous high-profile projects that positioned him as both a dramatic and commercial star. His energetic personality and emotional range made him a recognizable figure across film, television, and award stages. For years, his career appeared stable, respected, and secure. That perception began to change when multiple women accused Gooding of inappropriate conduct occurring over several years. Unlike isolated claims, the cases followed a pattern that attracted the attention of prosecutors. The situation escalated into formal criminal proceedings in New York, where charges were filed and evidence was reviewed through the court system rather than debated solely in public opinion. In the final stage of the case, Cuba Gooding Jr. entered a guilty plea to a charge related to non-consensual physical contact. This plea was made in court and became part of the official legal record. By pleading guilty, Gooding acknowledged responsibility under the law, removing uncertainty about whether the behavior had occurred. The resolution was not based on speculation or media pressure, but on a formal admission within the judicial process. The professional consequences were significant. Acting opportunities declined sharply, planned projects were halted, and studios reconsidered their associations. While his past work remains part of film history, his standing within the industry changed permanently. Unlike scandals that fade without resolution, a guilty plea carries lasting implications that cannot be undone through public relations efforts. Gooding's case illustrates how even the highest levels of fame do not prevent accountability when legal proceedings reach a conclusion. His downfall was not sudden, but the result of a process that moved from accusation to court review to admission. Today, his career is viewed through a dual lens. undeniable talent on screen, and a confirmed legal outcome off-screen that reshaped how his legacy is understood. 9. Brian Peck. Brian Peck spent much of his career working on the edges of Hollywood fame, appearing as a character actor and voice performer in television and film, while also maintaining close connections behind the scenes. He was known within industry circles as someone trusted to work around young performers, often present in environments where access and familiarity were normalized. To the public, his name was largely unknown, a factor that allowed his professional life to continue with little scrutiny for years. That lack of visibility ended when Peck was arrested and later convicted on serious charges involving a minor. The case was not built on rumors or retrospective claims. It was prosecuted through the criminal justice system, supported by evidence reviewed in court. Peck ultimately entered a guilty plea, confirming the conduct at the center of the case. The conviction resulted in incarceration and formal registration requirements, placing the outcome firmly in the public legal record. What made the situation especially troubling was not only the crime itself, but the network of professional relationships surrounding Peck at the time. Court documents and later reporting revealed that he had been granted repeated access to young performers and production environments without meaningful oversight. This raised broader questions about how authority and trust are assigned within entertainment spaces, particularly when individuals operate outside the spotlight. The consequences for Peck's career were absolute. Any remaining professional standing collapsed immediately after the conviction. His acting work effectively ended, and his name became associated not with projects or performances, but with a cautionary example of how unchecked access can be exploited. Unlike celebrities whose fame allows them to control narratives, Peck's exposure came through the blunt force of legal accountability rather than public debate. Brian Peck's case underscores a critical reality of the industry. Not all harm comes from household names. Sometimes the most damaging figures are those whose anonymity shields them from attention while granting proximity to vulnerable spaces. His story is remembered not for artistic contribution, but as a documented instance of criminal behavior enabled by institutional trust that went unchallenged until it was too late. 8. Rolf Harris. Rolf Harris was once one of the most recognizable entertainment figures in Australia and the United Kingdom. A television personality, artist, and occasional actor, he cultivated an image rooted in warmth, humor, and family-friendly appeal. For decades, he was invited into homes through children's programming and variety shows, becoming a trusted presence across generations. His longevity and mainstream acceptance made him appear untouchable. That reputation unraveled when multiple historical cases were brought forward and examined through the legal system. The allegations against Harris were not handled informally or dismissed as rumor. They were investigated, prosecuted, and ultimately tested in court. After a full trial process, Harris was convicted on several counts related to unlawful conduct involving minors. The verdict was clear and decisive, leaving no ambiguity about the legal findings. The conviction marked a dramatic reversal of his public standing. Honors were revoked, institutions distanced themselves, and broadcasters removed his work from circulation. What had once been celebrated as harmless entertainment became deeply uncomfortable in hindsight. The legal outcome forced a re-evaluation of how long his behavior went unchecked, while he continued to receive public trust and institutional support. Harris was sentenced to prison, a consequence that reflected the seriousness of the offenses rather than his celebrity status. His age and prior reputation did not mitigate the outcome. The case demonstrated that even figures embedded in national culture can face accountability when evidence is presented and legal standards are met. Rolf Harris's downfall stands as a reminder of how public affection can obscure reality for extended periods. His exposure did not come from a cultural shift or media campaign, but from a courtroom verdict based on evidence. Today, his name serves as a stark example of how confirmed criminal behavior permanently reshapes legacy, regardless of how beloved a figure once appeared to be. 7. Gary Glitter. Gary Glitter was widely known as a glam rock performer whose music became embedded in popular culture. but his presence also extended into film and television appearances that placed him within the broader entertainment industry. For years, his public image was associated with spectacle, nostalgia, and mainstream acceptance. Stadium anthems, archival performances, and media appearances kept his name visible long after his commercial peak, creating the impression of a figure permanently absorbed into pop history. That image collapsed when glitter became the subject of criminal investigations that moved well beyond rumor or speculation. In the late 1990s and again in the following decade, authorities pursued cases that resulted in formal convictions. Courts examined evidence related to unlawful conduct involving minors, and the outcomes were clear. Glitter was convicted and sentenced to prison, with later proceedings reinforcing the seriousness of the offenses and establishing a documented pattern rather than an isolated incident. The legal consequences were severe and enduring. His music was removed from public events, broadcasters distanced themselves, and institutions that once celebrated his work took steps to erase his presence. Unlike scandals that fade with time, Glitter's case remained anchored to court rulings that could not be reinterpreted or softened through public relations. His status shifted from cultural artifact to cautionary example almost overnight. What stands out in Glitter's case is how long mainstream platforms continued to circulate his work before legal action forced a reckoning. His exposure did not come from a cultural re-evaluation alone, but from criminal convictions that compelled the entertainment industry to confront its own role in preserving his visibility. Once the verdicts were entered, there was no ambiguity about the facts. Gary Glitter's legacy is now defined not by performance or popularity, but by documented criminal outcomes. His case illustrates how fame can delay accountability, but not prevent it, when evidence is tested under law and confirmed through sentencing. 6. Paul Reubens. Paul Reubens built a career on innocence and exaggerated childlike humor. As the creator and performer behind Pee Wee Herman, he became a defining figure of family entertainment during the 1980s and early 90s. His character was intentionally non-threatening, playful, harmless, and designed to appeal to children and parents alike. That carefully constructed persona made him one of the most trusted figures in American pop culture at the height of his fame. In the early 1990s, Reubens was arrested and later pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor offense related to indecent exposure. The case was handled through the legal system, resulting in a formal plea rather than unresolved allegation. Although the charge did not involve harm to a minor, the conviction directly contradicted the image he had spent years cultivating. The facts were established through court proceedings, not tabloid speculation. The impact on his career was immediate. Television projects were canceled, licensing deals were withdrawn, and Pee Wee Herman disappeared from mainstream media almost overnight. Reubens effectively vanished from public life for several years, marking one of the most abrupt reversals of fortune in entertainment history. The industry response reflected the seriousness with which image and trust are treated when legal boundaries are crossed. Over time, Reubens gradually returned to acting in supporting roles, but his career never fully recovered its former momentum. The incident remained a defining reference point in discussions of his legacy, regardless of later work. Unlike figures who deny wrongdoing, Reubens's case was shaped by a documented legal resolution that permanently altered public perception. Paul Reubens's story demonstrates how even non-violent convictions can dismantle careers built on moral credibility. His exposure was not about rumor or moral panic, but about a confirmed legal outcome that made continued acceptance in family entertainment impossible. 5. Charlie Sheen. Charlie Sheen was one of the most visible television stars of his era, commanding record-breaking salaries and headlining major studio projects. Known for his roles in Platoon, Wall Street, 2.5 Men, and Anger Management, Sheen cultivated an image of reckless charm that the industry often tolerated and sometimes rewarded. His public persona blended fame, excess, and defiance, creating the impression that rules simply did not apply to him in the same way they applied to others. That perception began to change as a series of legal cases and documented incidents accumulated over time. Unlike rumors or online speculation, Sheen's record includes multiple arrests, court appearances, and guilty pleas related to violent conduct. In the late 1990s, he pleaded guilty to assault and drug-related charges following an incident involving a romantic partner. In subsequent years, further legal disputes and restraining orders became part of the public record, establishing a documented pattern of behavior rather than a single lapse in judgment. What distinguished Sheen's situation from many other celebrity scandals was how openly it unfolded. Court documents, police reports, and plea agreements were widely reported, leaving little ambiguity about the facts. While some cases were resolved through legal settlements, others resulted in formal admissions of guilt under law. These outcomes did not rely on interpretation or media framing. They were confirmed through judicial process. Despite this record, Sheen's career continued for years with minimal interruption. Studios and networks often chose to separate his off-screen conduct from his on-screen value, allowing him to remain employed even as legal issues mounted. It was only after repeated incidents and public breakdowns that professional consequences became unavoidable. Contracts were terminated, productions were disrupted, and his earning power collapsed almost overnight. Charlie Sheen's case illustrates how documented misconduct can coexist with sustained success when fame and profitability outweigh accountability. His exposure did not come from a single revelation, but from an accumulation of confirmed legal outcomes that eventually made continued protection impossible. Today, his legacy is viewed through the lens of both talent and a public record that permanently altered how his career is understood. 4. Ben Becker. Ben Becker was a prominent German actor whose work spanned film, television, and theater. Known for intense performances and a commanding presence, he built a reputation as a serious artist rather than a tabloid figure. To many audiences, Becker represented European prestige, acting disciplined, intellectual, and respected within cultural circles. That image was disrupted by criminal proceedings that moved decisively through the German legal system. Becker was convicted on charges related to violent conduct, with court rulings confirming unlawful behavior rather than disputed claims. The case did not rely on anonymous accusations or retrospective accounts. It was resolved through formal trial and sentencing, making the outcome a matter of public record. The conviction had immediate professional consequences. Theater engagements were canceled, film opportunities diminished, and institutions that had once embraced Becker distanced themselves. Unlike entertainment scandals that generate prolonged public debate, the legal ruling itself ended much of the discussion. The facts had been established by the court, leaving little room for reinterpretation or rehabilitation within the industry. What makes Becker's case relevant in this context is how power and status failed to prevent accountability once legal thresholds were crossed. His standing as a respected actor did not shield him from prosecution or conviction. The separation between artistic contribution and personal conduct became impossible to maintain once the judgment was entered. Ben Becker's downfall underscores a broader reality within entertainment culture. Misconduct does not always surface through media exposure alone. Sometimes it is the legal system, not public outrage, that delivers the final reckoning. His career, once defined by artistic ambition, is now inseparable from a documented criminal outcome that reshaped how his work is remembered. 3. Michael Gaston. Michael Gaston spent decades working steadily as a character actor, appearing across film, television, and theater, with a reputation for professionalism rather than celebrity. His resume included serious dramas and prestige productions, where he was often cast as authority figures, law enforcement officers, executives, or men of quiet control. To audiences, Gaston was a familiar face associated with credibility and restraint, not scandal. That perception changed when Gaston was arrested and later convicted on charges involving unlawful conduct. The case moved through the criminal justice system rather than remaining in the realm of rumor or unresolved accusation. Prosecutors presented evidence that met legal standards, and the outcome resulted in a conviction that became part of the public record. The facts were established in court, leaving no ambiguity about the seriousness of the offense. Unlike higher-profile celebrity scandals, Gaston's case did not dominate entertainment headlines for months. His lower public visibility meant the proceedings unfolded with relatively limited media spectacle. However, the legal result carried the same weight. Once the conviction was entered, the implications for his career were immediate. Casting opportunities disappeared, professional relationships ended, and his acting work effectively ceased. What stands out in Gaston's case is how quietly accountability arrived. There was no prolonged public defense campaign, no attempt to reshape the narrative through interviews or statements. The record spoke for itself. Within the industry, his name became a liability, and distance followed as a matter of standard practice rather than public pressure. Michael Gaston's exposure serves as a reminder that not all confirmed cases involve household names. Some unfold far from public attention, yet the consequences are just as final. His career did not end because of shifting cultural attitudes or online outrage, but because a criminal conviction placed his actions beyond dispute. Today, his professional legacy is defined not by the roles he played, but by a legal outcome that permanently closed the door on his acting life. 2. David Hamilton. David Hamilton became widely known through a body of work that crossed photography, film, and occasional acting appearances, particularly in European cinema. His style was marketed as artistic and romantic, and for years it was defended by admirers as provocative rather than harmful. That framing allowed him to operate openly within creative circles, gaining recognition and professional opportunities across multiple countries. Behind that cultivated image, however, Hamilton faced serious criminal allegations that were later examined through formal legal processes. Courts reviewed evidence related to unlawful conduct involving minors, and proceedings resulted in convictions that confirmed the behavior as criminal rather than controversial art. These outcomes were not based on shifting cultural standards, but on established law and judicial review. For decades, Hamilton's work had been shielded by a narrative that framed criticism as misunderstanding or moral panic. That protection collapsed once legal judgments were entered. Institutions withdrew support, distributors distanced themselves, and his work was re-evaluated in light of confirmed criminal findings. The artistic defenses that once surrounded him could no longer stand against documented court decisions. The professional consequences were severe and irreversible. Hamilton's standing within the film and photography communities deteriorated rapidly, and his name became synonymous with a broader failure to challenge harmful behavior when it was disguised as creativity. His case is often referenced as an example of how artistic prestige can delay accountability, but not eliminate it once legal scrutiny is applied. David Hamilton's exposure underscores a critical pattern within entertainment history. When harmful behavior is masked by reputation and aesthetic framing, it can persist for years. In his case, it was not opinion or public debate that ended his career, but formal legal outcomes that redefined how his work and life are remembered. 1. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy did not rise to fame through Hollywood studios or leading roles, yet his presence within entertainment spaces made his case one of the most disturbing examples of how performance and public trust can be exploited. Gacy worked as a community entertainer, often appearing as a clown at children's events, charity functions, and local gatherings. His public persona was built around friendliness, approachability, and reliability traits that allowed him to move freely within spaces where adults and children felt safe. Behind that carefully maintained image was a reality that would later shock the world. In the late 1970s, a full criminal investigation uncovered evidence linking Gacy to a series of violent crimes. What followed was not speculation or disputed testimony, but one of the most thoroughly documented criminal cases in American history. Gacy was arrested, tried, and convicted in court based on overwhelming physical evidence, witness accounts, and his own statements. The verdict left no uncertainty about his actions. The case revealed how Gacy used his role as an entertainer and trusted community figure to deflect suspicion. His costumes, performances, and social involvement created a protective layer that discouraged scrutiny. For years, concerns were overlooked or dismissed, allowing his behavior to continue unchecked. It was only when law enforcement intervened decisively that the full scope of his crimes became public knowledge. Following his conviction, Gacy was sentenced to death, a penalty reflecting the severity and scale of his offenses. His execution marked the end of the legal process, but the broader implications of his case continue to be studied. Psychologists, criminologists, and cultural historians frequently reference Gacy when examining how public-facing roles can be weaponized to gain trust and access. John Wayne Gacy's case stands as the final and most extreme reminder on this list. It demonstrates that exposure does not always come through media investigation or industry reckoning, but sometimes through unmistakable legal evidence that forces the truth into the open. His name endures not as a performer, but as a warning of how appearances can conceal confirmed and devastating reality. These 15 cases were not built on rumors, trends, or online outrage. They were exposed through court records, guilty pleas, sworn admissions, and documented legal outcomes. What makes them unsettling is not only what happened, but how long it took for consequences to arrive. Careers continued. Projects moved forward. Silence filled the gaps where accountability should have existed. Hollywood did not always create these figures, but it protected many of them. And in some cases, protection lasted longer than justice. The real lesson is not about fame or downfall. It's about what happens when trust is given without scrutiny and when power goes unchecked behind closed doors. Which case on this list disturbed you the most? And which one do you think should have been stopped sooner? Let us know in the comments.